Welcome all PCU members. Today I'd like to share with you a game of mine from my very early years in chess that I played when I was just 8 years old. And here is the game, which I started by playing e4, e5, developing my knight, attacking the pawn on e5. My opponent protected that, and now I chose to play the Scotch by playing d4. In those days, I always used to play the Scotch, which is this opening that we see in front of us. Of course, I only mean if my opponent chooses the same first two moves as she chose in this game. This is the first critical moment in the game where my opponent needs to react to an attack. As I keep mentioning in the various lessons, in every move you need to be aware of what your opponent wants to do in order to defend against them properly. Like in this situation, if you would have the black pieces, white with the last move, moving the pawn up from d2 to d4, attacks a second time the pawn on e5. Now, you would have a number of choices in such or similar situations. The obvious one, to run away, or in this case, to run away by capturing the attacker. That would be pawn capturing on d4. Another option would be to protect the pawn with another one of your pieces. That option could be with one of your pawns, or the bishop going to d6, or even the queen moving out. And we'll talk about those one by one, why some are better than others. Alternatively, an option could be to counterattack, to attack one of the other white pieces. Such move could be to move the bishop to b4, which would be giving a check. In this particular case, that would not be a good choice. And in similar situations, whenever there is a way to block that check with the pawn, then it's not a good idea to give that check. Why? Because after the pawn moves up to block the check, it means the bishop now has to move again, and that would be a loss of time. In the early part of the game, we typically want to do everything we can not to waste time, not to move with the same piece multiple times. You would want to develop your knight, your bishop, put your king into safety by castling, and then develop your other bishop and other knight. So in this case, moving the bishop to b4 doesn't really achieve much in that direction, as after white makes a developing move which strengthens the center d4 square, or the pawn being there, the bishop needs to move again, and the bishop could have gone to that square the first place, right? So therefore, this check would not be a good idea. Okay, let's talk about the ways black can protect his pawn on e5. An option would be to do it with a pawn with f7 to f6. Would not be a good option though, because after the bishop would appear on c4, black would have serious difficulty in castling at the end of the day. Because even after the black bishop and knight gets out, in between the black king and rook on h8, black still would not be able to castle, because the bishop would be guarding the g8 square, the square where the king would be landing. Moving the queen out at this stage wouldn't be very advisable either, because it would block in the development of the bishop. And the general rule of thumb is, do not move early with your queen prior to finishing the development of your minor pieces and castling. Objectively, the best choice right now is actually to do the trade. Even the best way to develop the pawn on e5 is inferior to that, and that would be to develop the pawn, move the pawn up to d6, protecting the pawn on e5, but nevertheless it would be a little passive because it would limit the further development of the bishop from f8 to more active places such as black could do, for example, after trading on d4 and then moving the bishop to c5. So while it's certainly a reasonable move to play d6 right now, it's only the second best to the trade on d4. In the game itself, my opponent chose to play bishop to d6. While it's true it protects the pawn, however, it positions the black bishop to an unfortunate square. Why is it unfortunate? It is because it steps right in front of black's d7 pawn. What it means that now the pawn cannot advance, and therefore the bishop from c8 will have difficulty in develop in a natural way. Right now, White has, of course, numerous reasonable moves to develop. White could develop, for example, the bishop to c4, or the knight to c3, or reasonable moves, or even the trade on e5 wouldn't be bad. I personally chose to advance my pawn to d5, and with that close the structure of the position. When there are no immediate options to exchange pawns, which would be opening the position, and making a move like this closes the position because it prevents that opportunity for the near future. Now, of course, the good news about the move is that it forces black to react to an attack. Right now, the black knight is immediately attacked and it needs to move if it doesn't want to get lost. And my opponent made a careless move. Instead of moving the knight to a safe square, and the best of those squares would be to move to e7, my opponent wanted to move forward, not thinking it through and not realizing timely that now I have two pieces attacking that knight, my queen and the knight, while she only had a pawn protecting it. Of course, in such situations, it's really important the order in which you would capture the knight. Even though you're capturing with two pieces, the queen and the knight, it would be a humongous difference if you would capture with the queen first. It would be a truly bad choice. After queen takes knight, you would lose your queen. So therefore, you would want to capture with the knight, as I did in the game, and my opponent captured back with the pawn, and now we can see why it's important that I had two pieces attacking that same square. Now my queen can come out and capture the pawn. You may wonder, but didn't Susan just say that it's not a good idea to bring your queen out prior to finishing development of the minor pieces? Yes, I did say so, and I still mean that. However, it's very important to keep in front of us the proper order of priorities. And as I keep mentioning lesson after lesson, it is, first of all, the safety of your king, making sure your king doesn't get checkmated. Second of all, the value of material. So if you can win material, that's certainly ahead of strategical elements such as not bringing a queen out or doubling up your pawns or any similar. At the same time, it's less important than the safety of your king. So what we're seeing in this case, white won a pawn while temporarily staying behind in development and moving the queen out early. However, as black does not have an immediate way of taking any advantage of that, it's certainly a good thing to win a pawn, because the extra pawn remains, while the disadvantage, that's lack of development, is only temporary, and white will be able to catch up and complete development within the next few moves. Again, it's important to recognize that white not only captured a pawn, but developed an additional, a new threat, and that threat is the pawn on g7. Now the queen is about to capture that pawn, so black needs to do something about it. Of course, moving the pawn from g7 would be another blunder, because then an even more valuable piece, the rook on h8, would be lost. The queen would capture it. So black needs to look for a way to protect the pawn, to save it without moving it. Moving the bishop back to f8 wouldn't certainly look good, because it would develop backwards, and black would get even further from the hope of castling. Moving the king to f8 to protect the pawn on g7 would not be a great idea either, because that would give up the right to castle altogether for the remaining of this game. So the best black can do is to interpose between the attacker, the queen on d4, and the attacked pawn on g7. And the square where he can do that safely is on f6. In fact, black has various ways to do that. Put a pawn there from f7, or the knight, or the queen. Pushing the pawn up to f6 is certainly a reasonable choice, although it does not develop. A playable move here would be to move the knight to f6 to continue with development, even though it seems that white now can make an immediate fork attacking black's bishop and knight. Which is true, however, black has a resourceful defense or counterattack here, in fact, exactly because white is staying behind development. Black now is able to play queen e7, which pins the pawn, enables it to capture either the bishop nor the knight, and at the same time also attacks the pawn on e5 a second time. If now white chooses the natural defense of the pawn by f4, then black gets very decent counterplay, playing bishop to c5 right now, attacking the queen, gaining time. And when the queen moves away, for example, to d3, then knight g4, developing a dangerous threat of putting the knight on f2, which in turn would attack white's queen and rook simultaneously. Okay, let's go back and see the situation that we had after queen takes. So the bottom line is black could play here knight f6. In fact, that most likely would be the best choice in this case, as e5 is not dangerous, and white's best option is now not to play e5, but rather just play developing move, bishop e2, getting ready to castle, and also making sure that even if the black queen comes to e7 anyway, the pin won't be visible, because there is yet another piece between the queen on e7 and the king on e1. On the other hand, in the game, black made yet another mistake by playing queen f6. Well, what does this move do? It certainly guards the pawn on g7, and in fact, it attacks white's queen on d4. However, at the same time, it also proposes the exchange of the queens. And as we've learned already, whenever a side is ahead in material, it is to that side's favor to exchange pieces, and especially queens. On the other side of the token, if you're behind material, you want to avoid the exchange of pieces and especially queens. So therefore, this wasn't a great choice for black. I, on my end, happily exchanged those queens that I could, and now naturally black should capture back with the knight, not with the pawn, because if the pawn would capture back, the pawn structure would be certainly ruined for black by having double pawns on the F file instead of nicely connected pawns on the F, G, and H files. Also, the F and H pawns right now are all isolated, which are slightly inferior in power and value than if the pawns are nicely connected, as we see it right now. My opponent understood that naturally and captured back with the knight, keeping the pawn structure healthy. Also, it is a developing move, and yet at the same time also creates an immediate attack on the pawn on e4. At this stage, I have several ways I can protect that pawn. I chose to develop my bishop, although developing my knight to c3 was certainly a reasonable choice as well. Bishop d3, and my opponent castled. It's true that the queens are gone from the board, but nevertheless there are still a good number of pieces on the board, and therefore it is indeed advisable to still castle for both sides. And we both did so. And right now my opponent moved her bishop to e5. Well, this move has several purposes. One is to step away from in front of the d7 pawn, and that the d7 pawn can soon advance, and then the bishop on c8 can get out. Another reason is to prevent, at least for the time being, the development of my bishop on c1. It would be tragic to develop my bishop, for example, to g5 right now, because not only that black would win the pawn back after bishop b2, but would right away trap my rook in the corner, and that certainly would be a painful thought for white. I understood that danger, and that is why I instead played a preparation move first, playing c3. By putting this c pawn in between the black bishop and the b2 pawn, it releases the duty of the bishop on c1, so in the next moves it can get out if I want to. My opponent played c6, which is not a bad idea, trying to release the bind that the d5 pawn creates by being there. At this point, I chose to attack the bishop on e5 with my pawn, although it was not the only reasonable choice. I could have, for example, protected my pawn by playing c4. Game continued with f4, and the bishop retreated to c7. And at this point, I traded the pawns on c6, and my opponent captured back with the d-pawn. Perhaps a slightly better option for my opponent was to give a check first, and when the king moves to the corner, then to capture back. Why? Because it controls now the dark square on the g1 a7 diagonal, with a potential threat of black's knight appearing on g4 and f2. In fact, white's best move right now is to prevent that plan and play h3. Let's go back again. And here we are. My opponent, as I mentioned, right now took back immediately with the d-pawn, allowing my bishop to get out to e3. Even though I'm getting forward in the development phase, within the last few moves, I certainly gave activity to my opponent, which I shouldn't have done. And this was the moment where my opponent made the losing mistakes, several in a row. However, it's interesting to note that, as the famous saying goes, in chess, usually it's not enough to make one mistake. You usually need to make 3 to 5 mistakes in order to lose a game. And this is a perfect example for that. My opponent played knight g4, which is certainly a natural looking move. A much better option was, on the other hand, to first attack my other bishop with the rook. Now, if I don't want to lose my pawn on e4, I would have to retreat the bishop on c2, and only now to come to g4 with the knight. Now the bishop better remains on this diagonal and go to d4, because, for example, if the bishop retreats to c1, black immediately would gain initiative and at least win a pawn after these checks by safely capturing on e4 with a discovered check. Let's put back a couple of moves. And even if the bishop right now would move rather to d4 than to c1, black would play b6 with the threat of then playing c4, and the white dark squared bishop wouldn't then find a very comfortable square to go to. On the other hand, if white plays now b4, preventing that c5 move, then black again can push the issue by playing bishop a6, attacking white's rook again. Now that rook is protecting the pawn on f4, and if it intends to continue to do so by playing rook f3, the black bishop will arrive on e2, and finally white will have to give up on the pawn on f4. Let's go back again. Here we go, bishop e3, and as we said, rook d8 was the good move right now for black. So seeing what we just saw, we can conclude that when my opponent played c6, I was better off either protecting the pawn or instead of the bishop e3 move, play h3, preventing all these unpleasant threats coming with knight g4. The game continued with knight g4, and I moved my bishop to d4, making sure the bishop b6 move does not come with a check. And here black made another mistake by not following up aggressively the last move and play rook d8. That was the best choice black had right now, although white is better in this position if white finds the correct move. If white would be careless and would just continue developing, that would give black the opportunity to use the pile up of the d-file of the white pieces, use the pin with c5. Now if bishop takes, then the other bishop on d3 will be lost. So therefore, here white's best move is bishop e2 to maintain the advantage. Instead, in this position, my opponent played bishop b6, which is following the wrong principle, the opposite. Right? White is ahead material and black is looking to trade pieces. That's certainly not the right thing to do. And I should have indeed traded those bishops, which at the same time would have forced black to create double pawns after the pawn from a7 would recapture. I thought it didn't matter and played h3 first, attacking the black knight. The reason why this is inferior from trading immediately is because it gives black the opportunity not just to capture, but much better, play c5 and counterattack first. And now, after pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and black has dual threats. The pawn on g4 is attacked by the light squared bishop, and black is also threatening to trade on c3 with a discovered check. So therefore, I would lose one of my pawns. Let's go back again. And after h3, luckily for me, my opponent instead traded bishops. And now I have a solid and safe extra pawn. And here came the final mistake when black, instead of retreating the knight and accepting to deal with the situation, wanted to play actively and enter the knight to e3. This is one of those examples when activity is not good. We can see that the lonely knight is all surrounded by enemy pieces, and all white needs to do is to attack that knight, and that knight has no retreat. And that's exactly what happened in the game. At this stage, my opponent had no choice but give up his knight for a pawn, which I captured, and I'll just show a few more moves. h6, knight c3, bishop d7, d5, trade, trade. Now my knight has a beautiful position, bishop c6, and I'm happy to do another trade, check, trade. Now black has isolated pawns and a new target in the c6 pawn, rook a c1, and quickly doubling the rooks, Rook f d8. Of course, have to pay attention to the opponent's plans. The bishop is hanging. Bishop a6. Defend and counterattack at the same time. And rook's doubled. And black now could only temporarily hang on to the pawn with rook d6 because bishop b5 could use the pin and attack the pawn a third time. My opponent gave up on it immediately when I captured the pawn. Rook d2, king g3, rook takes, and she got the pawn back, attacking my other pawn on a2. Bishop c4, again, defend on a2 and attack on f7 at the same time. Rook c2, bishop d5. And yet another principal mistake for black, trading rooks. When you're behind, especially when all you have left are the pawns and you're down a bishop, the last thing you'd want to do is trade rooks. I was happy to see that. f6, bishop d5. Now the only thing left is to create a pass pawn and then to queen that pawn. Takes. Of course, I could push my e-pawn, but I moved my king. Bishop e6, stopping the advancement of that g-pawn. And today here I would rather play king d5, but in the game I play king c5, going after the a7 pawn, g4, bishop takes, and here my opponent finally resigned. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned from some of the mistakes made by both players in this game. Thank you, and so long until next time.